What's up, YouTube? Sergio Becerra II here again, and welcome back to my channel. And I know it's been a long time since I've done a book review video, so today we're going to get back into them, and we're going to start off with the history book, and it's by one of my favorite historians, the British historian Dan Jones, and his greatest work, the Plantagenets. So anybody from the United Kingdom is familiar with the Plantagenet Dynasty, I'll be covering this. So the Plantagenet Dynasty is like one of the greatest dynasties of British history, starting off with King Henry II of England all the way to his final descendant, Richard III. But this book covers the first couple of centuries, starting with Henry II up until Richard II. So let's get into it. Henry II was originally born in France. He was the son of Matilda, who was the Holy Roman Empress. She was supposed to be the one next in line to the throne, but her cousin Stephen took the throne. And by the time Stephen had died, Henry II took the throne. England at the time was just nothing more but a failed state. You had nothing but constant conflicts with the English barons, always fighting over land and property, whatever. By the time Henry took the throne, he was already now being rough on the nobility. He was taking away lands, castles from the barons by simply telling them, "I'll give you, I'll give you back these properties, these castles, whatever, but you work for me." Shortly after taking the throne, he marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, who originally was the Queen of France and had been married to Louis VII of France. Shortly after, within a couple of months, she marries Henry. And then shortly after becoming the Queen of England, Henry needed some people that will help him run the country for him, not the nobility, but of the typical folk, merchants. And one of the merchants, who later became his best friend and who later became a saint, was Thomas Becket. Because he needed like advice, whatever advice he can to help him run the country instead of the barons. Shortly after, that, become good friends, become good drinking friends, all that. But then once the previous Archbishop of Canterbury dies, Henry's like, okay, I need someone to run things for me, even though I don't have any control over the church. So he bullies the monks into electing Thomas Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury, but things backfire because once Becket becomes the Archbishop, Henry is no longer his boss. It's God now. So he takes his new religious life seriously and ends up ignoring Henry's orders in the better part of 7 years. And then one day, Henry decides to make his eldest son, the young Henry, as the new king of England, but king in waiting, because once Henry dies, he can immediately take full control. But it was Becket's job as the Archbishop of Canterbury, as like a big leading position. He's not president. Henry doesn't want him there. He had someone else crown the young king. What Becket does, he decides to excommunicate anyone that was involved in the young king's coronation. So once it reaches the ears of Henry II for what he did, Henry decides, okay, I'm going to punish him. So he orders his knights to go over to Canterbury to punish him. But there were some words that were taken out of context. Henry's knights ended up killing Becket. Word of Becket reaches all the way to Europe, especially in Rome, because shortly after, in 1170, Pope Alexander III declares him a saint. His life declared martyrdom because of Henry's actions. So that it leads people to it was starting to make people wonder if Henry II was actually fit to be king. But then he starts making more enemies, this time within his own family, because Eleanor, like Henry, which I will mention, her favorite son would be the future Richard I, because her goal was to make Richard the new Duke of Aquitaine, because Henry had control of some of the territories within France. Eleanor still was the Duchess of Aquitaine. Those were her lands, her property. Wanted to give to Richard once she dies, but Henry decides to sell parts of Eleanor's Aquitaine to secure a political alliance, making Henry not only making Henry taking control of some of these territories, but having his barons collect the taxes. So this now makes Eleanor really mad with Henry. Now, without knowing, Henry's own wife is now an enemy. Richard, on the other hand, he's spilling. Well, no. Richard, he's already getting mad that his inheritance is now being taken away. Not only that, Henry's eldest son, the young King Henry, also ends up becoming Henry's next enemy, because there's a castle that still exists in France. Let me try to remember that. Chinon Castle. Instead of the young king getting the castle which Henry was supposed to give him, Henry's youngest son and favorite, John, gets the castle. Young Henry is mad that he's not getting that castle. So now Henry's got enemies within his own family. So what does young Henry and Richard do? They plot with they start plotting and conspiring along with Louis VII of France to help get Henry off the throne, put young Henry on the throne instead. And not only that, also working with the barons, helping them regain control of the country. And not only that, also getting Scotland involved. Forgive me, I forget how it goes. All I know that Henry's got wars all around him, from the Scottish border, then his own sons. But then Eleanor later gets involved because she's the architect of the whole plot. Because after she sends Richard to France to help with his brother along with Louis, she later follows within 10 days. But Henry II's men, and along with the king, catch up with her. So now she's become a prisoner and is later held in a castle in France. So once everything is completely settled, both the young king and Richard have to stop their plot and step down from taking any kind of action against their own father. Soon after, Henry forgives them, gives them money, gives them lands, whatever. But since Harry has an obsession of control, has an obsession with control of what he doesn't want to give his sons anything. But then shortly, within 9 years, Henry's eldest son, the young King Henry, dies of dysentery. So now Richard is expected to be named as his successor, but doesn't want to risk either naming Richard or John as one of their successors. So what does Richard do? Plots against his father yet again, along with the new king, Philip II, by having to take all of Henry's lands away. So this forces the 50-year-old Henry II to travel to Chinon Castle, meet with Richard, and Richard just lays out his demands. Simple: land, money, and becoming the next king. Henry, who's old, tired, just simply nods his head. He just simply nods his head and agrees. And as soon as the negotiations and demands were done, Henry leans forward and whispers to Richard, "God grant that I may not die until I have my revenge on you." But Henry dies within 2 days after showing up in Chinon. Henry and Eleanor and Richard, along with Richard's queen, are buried in France, but not John. John is buried in England. Why? Because by the time John becomes the king, all the lands that his father had been in control of are lost. By the time John dies, was it Pont? No, what's the name of the abbey? I'm trying to name it that French abbey, where Henry, Eleanor, and Richard are buried in. I'm sorry. Let me try to think really quick. Fontevraud Abbey. Yeah, that's where Henry is buried. Because by the time John dies, the abbey that houses both Henry, Richard, and their queen's tombs, it's all under the control of the French crown. Now, okay, but now we can start off with Richard the First, which was actually Henry's other son, who succeeds him. And as we all know, familiar with Richard the Lionheart, he's well remembered for his role in the Third Crusade after the Crusaders lost Jerusalem. I forget the name of the battle that took place which cost the Crusaders and the Knights Templars to lose Jerusalem. So once Pope Gregory the Eighth called for a third crusade to get Jerusalem back, that was when originally the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick the First decided to take up the call, but the emperor ends up dying along the way in a river while on his way to Jerusalem, along with 100,000 German troops. But then Richard takes the lead and starts leading his own men to the Holy Land. So, to make this very quick on this part, Richard does not get Jerusalem back, but he does reclaim some of the other territories that were lost. But Jerusalem still remained under Turkish hands. So instead of Richard going back to England, he stays within his father's territories in France. I think that would be Aquitaine. John, on the other hand, since Richard was fighting in the Holy Land, he took control. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. Both Richard and John are living in France in their father's territories. They don't want to stay in England because of weather conditions, knowing that it's always cold and raining all the time. Richard dies from a battle wound while fighting in France. Then, John, he becomes his successor because Richard didn't have any kids. John, on the other hand, he's like one of the worst kings of the Plantagenet Dynasty and one of the worst kings of England. He ends up losing all his father's territories because of how incompetent he is. And John is the reason for the Robin Hood story. So once John loses the territories, he's forced to go back and rule in England, which he does not want to. So what does John do to reclaim lands? He starts hiking taxes, hiking anything for whatever reason, until he accumulates about 100,000 British pounds, which is enough to secure another invasion of France to gain back his territories. But everything goes completely wrong. Now, once John returns back to England, the barons are like, okay, now we got him because this is out of control. That is when they drafted Magna Carta, Latin for the Great Charter, because now the king's powers are limited. The king's powers are limited. Now, the king still has absolute power, but Richard's powers were limited at that time. He doesn't like the idea of giving his people liberties, nothing like that, and that his rule is limited. He can't tax without the barons saying so. And since he was already getting uh, into a feud with the Vatican with Pope Innocent III, by because John ended up getting excommunicated for taxing the church, which he had no right to do. Yet still, John decides to write to the Pope, getting this charter null and void, which the Pope does approve. That's when he starts making his move again and starts taxing and taking away lands, whatever. I know that John's reign was already becoming a bigger threat, but I'm trying to make it as short as possible. So John, on the other hand, the charter's renewed. He's still in conflict with the barons, which later leads to the revolt with him. John dies of, I think it was dysentery. Not only that, before he died, John lost the royal jewels, including the crown. So once John died, and he's later succeeded by his eldest son and heir, who becomes Henry III. Henry, 9-year-old Henry, who was only 9 at the time, since John was responsible for losing the crown, Henry was crowned with a gold band around his head. But by the time he reached adulthood, he too had to go by Magna Carta. But Henry was known to violate it more than once. But I'm not going to get into much more detail with Henry III. So now let's fast forward now with Henry's son and heir, Edward I. Now, if you remember from the movie, what was it? I can't believe I'm forgetting now. What is it? I have the movie. I can't believe I can't remember now. It's with Mel Gibson. I'm pretty sure you all know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Braveheart. That's right. As soon as Edward I took the throne, he starts getting into a conflict with Scotland because their king dies and he had no heir. So Edward tries to expand his territory by trying to take over Scotland. Edward I was recognized as Edward Longshanks because he was known to be like the only king that was like pretty tall. I mean, if you're familiar with the movie Braveheart, you probably know what I'm talking about because Edward was a very powerful soldier, especially under his father's reign, Henry III, because Henry III, like his grandfather, had a best friend in which he ends up becoming enemies with, because Henry was just as bad as his father, trying to trying to make wars, knowing his powers were limited. But once Edward I died and succeeded by his son, who became Edward II, things got way worse with Edward II because Edward, he was suspected of being homosexual because his best friend was just nothing more than bad influence on him, Piers Gaveston. So Edward, I mean, if you're familiar with Braveheart, Edward II, who in the movie was still a prince at the time, marries Princess Isabella of France, daughter to Philip IV. But in reality, Edward II marries Isabella once Edward took the throne. But also he brings his best friend back, knowing it's just going to be creating problems completely. And just like with his grandfather and other ancestors, John and Henry III, their Edward II's powers were also further limited, basically almost taken away by a charter, which was an ordinance. One of them, of course, had to target his friend. It had nothing to do with rights or liberties or whatever. It was about going after Piers Gaveston. The nobility wanted Gaveston out of the way. So he gets exiled once again back to France. But what does Edward do? He brings him back, which ends up which ends up forcing the nobility kill to kill Gaveston. Basically, they put him on trial for treason. They put him on trial for treason because he returned to France by the king when told not to. So Gaveston was beheaded. And who was actually the main perpetrator? That would be Edward's cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. So since Lancaster was just so fed up with Edward and Gaveston's BS and all that, that was when Thomas of Lancaster, who was the Earl at the time, had him beheaded. Like I said, under the ordinance, Gaveston would return back to England, which Edward did. He'd be tried for treason, and you know what? That whole trial against him was all about King of Court. It was just made up of nobles that just hated him. So things get worse. Edward, I'm trying to put as much together as I can right now because it's a lot within this book. Edward also has to deal with his father's mess too, which is with trying to maintain the war in Scotland, but it all backfires, and of course Lancaster's not there to help him. But then it later turns out Lancaster had been working along with the Scots. So now Thomas of Lancaster ends up getting executed for treason. And then Edward, of course, he needed support. He needed allies, so he turns to this one family in Wales, the Despensers, and both father and son, both named Hugh. They help. They both help Edward gain whatever territory and whatever lands they can get their hands on, and which also creates a new enemy, Roger Mortimer, which I'll mention later, because his lands get taken away. Now he ends up, instead of becoming a longtime supporter of Edward, he now becomes an enemy. Now, this creates it later creates a further problem because now you got a war breaking out in France. Now he needs the queen to try to. So Edward tries to get his queen Isabella to go to France. What she does, talks with her brother Charles IV, try to get negotiations to let's just stop this war and just maintain peace. So Isabella's diplomacy works, but Isabella makes her move getting revenge on Edward because not only she had to put up with Gaveston, but also now that Edward was now being a puppet of the Spencers, her children get taken away. So she ends up declaring by herself her marriage with Edward like done because she's had to put up with all the mayhem coming from Edward on every corner. And guess who decides to take? Well, actually, Isabella ends up cheating on Edward by taking a new lover, and it's Roger Mortimer because Edward has him imprisoned, which he later escapes. So now those two are now lovers, and they decide to go back to England along with Edward's youngest son, not youngest son, eldest son, and son of an heir to the throne, the future Edward III. So Edward II, and of course Hugh Despenser Jr. They flee. They later get captured. Both Despenser, father and son, are dead. Edward, on the other hand, he's kept in a castle. Now, rumor has it either he was suffocated by being drowned with a pillow up to his face, or with a red hot poker that was shoved from his rectum, shoved right into his rectum. But who knows really, because the poker part didn't come into place like 60 years after. Now, Edward III also became a good king. One thing so far about Edward that he was around when the Black Plague struck Europe. So he ends up losing his only daughter after he betrothed her to France. I mean not to France. I mean to a Spanish prince. But once the plague started taking many lives, especially in UK, he and his eldest son they take shelter just to not get infected with the pestilence. Now, fast forward with Richard the Second. Richard the Second, who we're all familiar with, was actually the boy king at the time at age 14 to take down. I'm sorry, I know I'm trying to process this all as much as I can. He's the one that takes down the infamous peasants revolt because during the peasants revolt, the a lot of people, just normal folk, weren't paying their taxes. They were just fed up with everything that was going on within the country. And you know what? It was all being mishandled by the king's own counselors, bishop, and I think who else? Other nobles. I think the king's treasurer. This is that's who they wanted. They wanted both whoever this corrupt bishop and the treasurer at the time. They wanted them. Richard was this close to losing his crown. So, a 14-year-old kid, he decides to confront one of the rebels to confront the rebels' captain, but instead one of his knights takes down the leader. Tell Richard tells his people by by speaking in English, even though about half of the Plantagenet kings were actually speaking French at the time, which I forgot to mention. But here's the thing, Richard. I mean, he reminds his people he's both their king and their captain. They put down their arms. They praise him. But then shortly after, Richard really teaches them a lesson. Don't ever don't ever mess with me and my crown. Once Richard becomes a man, his own uncle really has to level with him. Don't act tyrannical, but then things things will get more out of hand because Richard's own cousin Henry Bolingbroke, between him and a number of nobles, they were wondering if they were going to depose him or not, but instead they led their loyalty to him. But then later on, Richard starts gaining revenge by taking them out one by one. That only leaves his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. So at one point, uh, when things got really bad with Richard by being super tyrannical, especially when he killed his own uncle, who had to treat him like a child. That's when Richard makes his move and deposes Richard, and he becomes Henry the Fourth. So this is all it right here. I apologize for acting slow. I mean, I'm trying to trying to process this as much as I can. I mean, there's just so much to cover, but I'll be covering more Plantagenet history in the next video. So from Henry, from Henry II to Richard II. Richard II. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. From Henry II to Richard II. That's where I'm so sorry again. I'm trying to process this as much as I can. So Henry II, who takes the throne, and by the time Richard II comes along, he gets deposed and is later replaced by his cousin, who usurps it, becoming Henry IV. In which later in the next video, I'm going to cover another Plantagenet book, also written by Dan Jones, which would be the Wars of the Roses. I'm sorry for acting so slow and taking a long time, but I just want to cover as much as the history as much as I can. So tell me what you think in the video. comment below, like and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for future updates. So I'll be seeing you soon. Take care now. Bye.